All to the north, the rain had dragged black tendrils down from the thunderclouds, like tracings of lamp-black fallen in a beaker, and in the night they could hear the drum of rain miles away on the prairie. They ascended through a rocky pass, and lightning shaped out the distant shivering mountains, and lightning rang the stones about, and tufts of blue fire clung to the horses like incandescent elementals that would not be driven off. Soft smelter lights advanced upon the metal of the harness. Lights ran blue and liquid on the barrels of the guns. Mad jack hares started and checked in the blue glare, and high among those clanging crags, jock and roe-hawks crouched in their feathers, or cracked a yellow eye at the thunder underfoot. They rode for days through the rain, and they rode through the rain and hail and rain again. In that gray stormlight, they crossed a flooded plain with the footed shapes of the horses reflected in the water among clouds and mountains, and the rider slumped forward, and rightly skeptic of the shimmering cities on the distant shore of that sea whereon they trod miraculous. They climbed up through rolling grasslands, where small birds shied away, chittering down the wind, and a buzzard labored up from among bones with wings that went whoop, 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 like a child's toy swung on a string, and in the long sunset the sheets of water on the plain below them lay like tide pools of primal blood. They passed through a highland meadow carpeted with wildflowers, acres of golden groundsel and zinnia, and deep purple gentian, and wild vines of blue morning glory, and a vast plain of varied small blooms, reaching onward like a gingham print to the farthest serried rimlands, blue with haze, and the adamantine ranges rising out of nothing like the backs of sea beasts in a Devonian dawn. It was raining again, and they rode slouched under slickers hacked from greasy half-cured hides, and so cowled in these primitive skins before the gray and driving rain they looked like wardens of some dim sect sent forth to proselytize among the very beasts of the land. The country before them lay clouded and dark. They rode through the long twilight, and the sun set, and no moon rose, and to the west the mountains shuddered again and again in clattering frames, and burned to final darkness, and the rain hissed in the blind night land. They went up through the foothills among pine trees and barren rock, and they went up through juniper and spruce, and the rare great aloes, and the rising stalks of yuccas, with their pale blooms silent and unearthly among the evergreens. In the night they followed a mountain torrent in a wild gorge choked with mossy rocks, and they rode under dark grottos where the water dripped and spattered and tasted of iron, and they saw the silver filaments of cascades divided upon the faces of distant buttes that appeared as signs and wonders in the heavens themselves, so dark was the ground of their origins. They crossed the blackened wood of a burn, and they rode through a region of cloven rock where great boulders lay happed, with smooth uncentered faces, and on the slopes of these ferret grounds old paths of fire and the blackened bones of trees assassinated in the mountain storms. On the day following they began to encounter holly and oak, hardwood forests much like those they had quit in their youth. In pockets on the north slopes hail lay nested like tektites among the leaves, and the nights were cool. They traveled through the high country deeper into the mountains, where the storms had their lairs, a fiery, clangorous region, where white flames ran on the peaks, and the ground bore the burnt smell of broken flint. At night the wolves in the dark forests of the world below called to them as if they were friends to man, and Glanton's dog trotted moaning among the endlessly articulating legs of the horses. 9 days out of Chihuahua, they passed through a gap in the mountains and began to descend by a trail that ran carved along the solid stone face of a bluff 1,000 feet above the clouds. A great stone mammoth watched from the gray escarpment above them. They picked their way down single file. They passed through a tunnel hewn in the rock, and on the other side, miles below them in a gorge, lay the roofs of a town. They descended by rocky switchbacks and across the beds of streams where small trout stood on their pale fins and studied the noses of the drinking horses. Sheets of mist that smelled and tasted of metal rose out of the gorge and crossed over them and moved on through the woods. They nudged the horses through the ford and down the trace, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in a thin and drizzling rain, they rode into the old stone town of Jesus Maria. They clattered over the rain-washed cobbles, stuck with leaves, and crossed a stone bridge and rode up the street under the dripping eaves of the galleried buildings and along a mountain torrent that ran through the town. Small ore mills had been ground into the polished rocks in the river, and the hills above the town were everywhere tunneled and scaffolded and scarred with drifts and tailings. The raggle-tag advent of the riders was howled about by a few wet dogs crouched in doorways, and they turned into a narrow street and halted dripping before the door of an inn. Glanton pounded on the door and it opened, and a young boy looked out. A woman appeared and looked at them and went back in. Finally a man came and opened the gate. He was slightly drunk, and he held the gate while the horsemen rode through one by one into the little flooded courtyard, and then he closed the gate behind them. In the morning the rain had stopped, and they appeared in the streets, tattered, stinking, ornamented with human parts like cannibals. They carried the huge pistols stuck in their belts, and the vile skins they wore were deeply stained with blood and smoke and gun-black. The sun was out, and the old woman, on their knees with the bucket and rag, washing the stones before the shop doors, turned and looked after them, and shopkeepers setting out their wares nodded them a wary good morning. They were a strange clientele among such commerce. They stood blinking before the doorways where finches hung in small withy cages, and green and brassy parrots that stood on one foot and croaked uneasily. There were ristras of dried fruit and peppers and clusters of tinware that hung like chimes, and there were hogskins filled with pulque that swung from the beams like bloated swine in a knacker's yard. They sent for cups. A fiddler appeared and crouched on a stone door-sill and began to saw out some Moorish folk tune, and none who passed on their morning errands could take their eyes from those pale and rancid giants. By noon they'd found a bodega run by a man named Frank Carroll, a low doggery once a stable whose shed doors stood open to the street to admit the only light. The fiddler had followed in what seemed a great sadness, and he took up his station just without the door, where he could watch the outlanders drink and clack their gold doubloons on the board. In the doorway there was an old man taking the sun, and he leaned with a goat-horn ear-trumpet to the rising din within, and nodded in continual agreement, although no word was spoken in any language he had understanding of. The judge had spied the musician, and he called to him and tossed a coin that clinked upon the stones. The fiddler held it briefly to the light as if it might not serve, and then slipped it away among his clothes, and fitted his instrument beneath his chin, and struck up an air that was old among the mountebanks of Spain 200 years before. The judge stepped into the sunlit doorway, and executed upon the stones a series of steps with a strange precision, and he and the fiddler seemed alien minstrels met by chance in this medieval town. The judge removed his hat and bowed to a pair of ladies detoured into the street to bypass the doggery, and he pirouetted hugely on his mincing feet and poured pulque from his cup into the old man's ear-trumpet. The old man quickly stoppered the horn with the ball of his thumb, and he held the horn with care before him while he augured his ear with one finger, and then he drank. By dark the streets were filled with besotted bedlamites, lurching and cursing and ringing the church bells with pistol balls and a godless chiavari, until the priest emerged bearing before him the crucified Christ, and exhorting them with fragments of Latin in a sing-song chant. This man was drubbed in the street and prodded obscenely, and they flung gold coins at him as he lay clutching his image. When he rose, he disdained to take up the coins until some small boys ran out to gather them, and then he ordered them brought to him while the barbarians whooped and drank him a toast. Spectators drifted away, the narrow street emptied. Some of the Americans had wandered into the cold waters of the stream and were splashing about, and they clambered dripping into the street and stood dark and smoking and apocalyptic in the dim lampfall. The night was cold, and they shambled steaming through the cobbled town like fairy brook beasts, and it had begun to rain again. The day that followed was the feast of Las Animas, and there was a parade through the streets in a horse-drawn cart that bore a rude Christ in a stained and ancient catafalque. Lay acolytes followed all in company, and the priest went before ringing a small bell. A barefoot brotherhood clad in black marched in the rear bearing scepters of weeds. The Christ jostled past, a poor figure of straw with carven head and feet. He wore a crown of mountain briars, and on his brow were painted drops of blood, and on his old dry wooden cheeks blue tears. The villagers knelt and blessed themselves, and some stepped forward and touched the garment the figure wore and kissed their fingertips. The parade trundled past mournfully, and small children sat in the doorways eating pastry skulls and watching the parade and rain in the streets. The judge sat alone in the cantina. He also watched the rain, his eyes small in his great naked face. He'd filled his pockets with little candied death's heads, and he sat by the door and offered these to children passing on the walk under the eaves, but they shied away like little horses. In the evening, groups of townsfolk descended from the cemetery on the side of the hill, and later, in the dark by candle or lamplight, they emerged again and made their way up to the church to pray. None but past clutches of Americans crazed with drink, and these grimy visitants would doff their hats oafishly and totter and grin and make obscene suggestions to the young girls. Carol had closed his squalid bistro at dusk, but opened it again to save the doors being stove. Sometime in the night a party of horsemen bound for California arrived, every man of them slumped in exhaustion. Yet within the hour they'd ridden out again. By midnight, when the souls of the dead were rumored to be about, the scalp hunters were again howling in the streets and discharging their pistols in spite of rain or death, and this continued sporadically until dawn. By noon the day following, Glanton in his drunkenness was taken with a kind of fit, and he lurched crazed and disheveled into the little courtyard and began to open fire with his pistols. In the afternoon he lay bound to his bed like a madman while the judge sat with him and cooled his brow with rags of water and spoke to him in a low voice. Outside voices called across the steep hillsides. A little girl was missing, and parties of citizens had turned out to search the mine shafts. After a while Glanton slept, and the judge rose and went out. It was gray and raining. Leaves were blowing down. A ragged stripling stepped from a doorway by a wooden rain-spout and tugged at the judge's elbow. He had 2 pups in his shirt front, and these he offered for sale, dragging one forth by the neck. The judge was looking off up the street. When he looked down at the boy hauled forth the other dog. They hung limply. Pero se vende, he said. ¿Cuánto quieres? Said the judge. The boy looked at one and then the other of the animals, as if he'd pick one to suit the judge's character, such dogs existing somewhere, perhaps. He thrust forth the left-hand animal. 50 centavos, he said. The pup squirmed and drew back in his fist like an animal backing down a hole, its pale blue eyes impartial, befrighted alike of the cold and the rain and the judge. Ambos, said the judge. He sought in his pockets for coins. The dog vendor took this for a bargaining device and studied the dogs anew to better determine their worth, but the judge had dredged from his polluted clothes a small gold coin worth a bushel of such-priced dogs. He laid the coin in the palm of his hand and held it out, and with the other hand took the pups from their keeper, holding them in one fist like a pair of socks. He gestured with the gold. Ándale, he said. The boy stared at the coin. The judge made a fist and opened it. The coin was gone. He wove his fingers in the empty air and reached behind the boy's ear and took the coin and handed it to him. The boy held the coin in both hands before him like a small ciborium, and he looked up at the judge. But the judge had set forth dogs dangling. He crossed upon the stone bridge, and he looked down into the swollen waters and raised the dogs and pitched them in. At the farther end the bridge gave onto a small street that ran along the river. Here the Van Diemenlander stood urinating from a stone wall into the water. When he saw the judge commit the dogs from the bridge, he drew his pistol and called out. The dogs disappeared in the foam. they swept one and the next down a broad green race over sheets of polished rock into the pool below. The Van Diemen Lander raised and cocked the pistol. In the clear waters of the pool, willow leaves turned like jade dace. The pistol bucked in his hand, and one of the dogs leaped in the water, and he cocked it again and fired again, and a pink stain diffused. He cocked and fired the pistol a third time, and the other dog also blossomed and sank. The judge continued on across the bridge. When the boy ran up and looked down into the water, he was still holding the coin. The Van Diemen Lander stood in the street opposite with his pizzle in one hand and the revolver in the other. The smoke had drifted off downstream, and there was nothing in the pool at all. Sometime in the late afternoon, Glanton woke and managed to struggle free of his bindings. The first news they had of him was in front of the cuartel, where he cut down the Mexican flag with his knife and tied it to the tail of a mule. Then he mounted the mule and goaded it through the square, dragging the sacred bandera in the mud behind him. He made a circuit of the streets and emerged in the plaza again, kicking the animal viciously in the flanks. As he turned, a shot rang out, and the mule fell stone dead under him with a musket ball lodged in its brain. Glanton rolled clear and scrambled to his feet, firing wildly. An old woman sank soundlessly to the stones. The judge and Tobin and Doc Irving came from Frank Carroll's on a dead run, and knelt in the shadow of a wall and began to fire at the upper windows. Another half-dozen Americans came around the corner at the far side of the square, and in a flurry of gunfire 2 of them fell. Slags of lead were winding off the stones, and gun smoke hung over the streets in the damp air. Glanton and John Gunn had made their way along the walls to the shed behind the posada, where the horses were stabled, and they began bringing the animals out. 3 more of the company entered the yard at a run, and commenced to tote gear out of the building and to saddle horses. Gunfire was now continual in the street, and 2 Americans lay dead and others calling out. When the company rode out 30 minutes later, they ran a gauntlet of ragged fusel fire and rocks and bottles, and they left 6 of their number behind. An hour later, Carroll and another American named Sanford, who's been residing in the town, caught them up. The citizens had torched the saloon. The priest had baptized the wounded Americans, and then stood back while they were shot through the head. Before dark, they encountered laboring up the western slope of the mountain a conducta of 122 mules bearing flasks of quicksilver for the mines. They could hear the whip crack and cry of the arrieros on the switchbacks far below them, and they could see the burdened animals plodding like goats along a fault line in the sheer rock wall. Bad luck. 26 days from the sea, and less than 2 hours out from the mines. The mules wheezed and scrabbled in the talus, and the drivers in their ragged and colorful costumes hurried them on. When the first of them saw the riders above them, he stood in the stirrups and looked back. The column of mules wound down the trail for a half-mile or more, and as they bunched and halted, there were sections of the train visible on the separate switchbacks far below, 8 and 10 mules, facing now this way, now that, the tails of the animals picked clean as bones by those behind, and the mercury within the gutta-percha flasks pulsing heavily as if they carried secret beasts, things in pairs that stirred and breathed uneasily within those bloated satchels. The muleteer turned and looked up the trail. Already Glanton was upon him. He greeted the American cordially. Glanton rode past without speaking, taking the upper side in that rocky straight, and shouldering the drover's mule dangerously among the loose shales. The man's face clouded, and he turned and called back down the trail. The other riders were now pushing past him, their eyes narrow and their faces black as stokers with gun soot. He stood down off his mule and drew his escopeta from under the fender of the saddle. David Brown was opposite him at this point, his pistol already in his hand at the offside of his horse. He swung it over the pommel and shot the man squarely in the chest. The man sat down heavily, and Brown shot him again, and he pitched off down the rocks into the abyss below. The others of the company hardly turned to advise themselves of what had occurred. Every man of them was firing point-blank at the muleteers. They fell from their mounts and lay in the trail or slid from the escarpment and vanished. The drivers below got their animals turned and were attempting to flee back down the trail, and the laden pack mules were beginning to clamber wide-eyed at the sheer wall of the bluff like enormous rats. The riders pushed between them and the rock and methodically rode them from the escarpment, the animals dropping silently as martyrs, turning sedately in the empty air and exploding on the rocks below in startling bursts of blood and silver as the flasks broke open and the mercury loomed wobbling in the air in great sheets and lobes and small trembling satellites, and all its forms grouping below and racing in the stone arroyos, like the embreachment of some ultimate alchemic work decocted from out the secret dark of the earth's heart, the fleeing stag of the ancients fugitive on the mountainside, and bright and quick in the dry path of the storm channels, and shaping out the sockets in the rock, and hurrying from ledge to ledge down the slopes, shimmering and deft as eels. The muleteers benched out in a swag on the trail where the precipice was almost negotiable, and they rode and fell crashing down through the scrub juniper and pine in a confusion of cries, while the horsemen herded the lag mules off after them, and rode wildly down the rock trail like men themselves at the mercy of something terrible. Carroll and Sanford had become detached from the company, and when they reached the bench where the last of the arrieros had disappeared, they reined their horses and looked back up the trail. It was empty, save for a few dead men from the conducta. 100 mules had been ridden off the escarpment, and in the curve of the bluff they could see the broken shapes of the animals strewn down the rocks, and they could see the bright shapes of the quicksilver pooled in the evening light. The horses stamped and arched their necks. The riders looked off down into that calamitous gulf, and they looked at each other, but they required no conference, and they pulled the mouths of the horses about and rowelled them on down the mountain. They caught up with the company at dusk. They were dismounted at the far side of a river, and the Kid and one of the Delawares were hazing the lathered horses back from the edge of the water. They put their animals to the ford and crossed, the water up under the horses' bellies, and the horses picking their way over the rocks, and glancing wildly upstream where a cataract thundered out of the darkening forest into the flecked and seething pool below. When they rode up out of the ford, the judge stepped forward and took Carroll's horse by the jaw. "Where's the nigger?" he said. He looked at the judge. They were all but at eye level, and he on horseback. "I don't know," he said. The judge looked at Glanton. Glanton spat. "How many men did you see in the square?" "I didn't have time to take no head count. There was 3 or 4 shot that I know of." "But not the nigger?" "I never saw him." Sanford pushed his horse forward. "There was no nigger in the square," he said. "I seen them shoot them boys, and they were ever one white as you and me." The judge turned loose Carroll's horse and went to get his own animal. 2 of the Delawares detached themselves from the company. When they rode out up the trail, it was almost dark, and the company had pulled back into the woods and posted vedettes at the ford, and they made no fire. No riders came down the trail. The early part of the night was dark, but the first relief at the ford saw it begin to clear, and the moon came out over the canyon, and they saw a bear come down and pause at the far side of the river and test the air with his nose and turn back. About daybreak, the judge and the Delawares returned. They had the black with them. He was naked save for a blanket he'd wrapped himself in. He didn't even have boots. He was riding one of the bone-tailed pack mules from the conducta, and he was shivering with cold. The only thing he'd saved was his pistol. He was holding it against his chest under the blanket, for he had no other place to carry it. The way down out of the mountains toward the western sea led them through green gorges thick with vines, where paroquets and gaudy macaws leered and croaked. The trail followed a river, and the river was up and muddy, and there were many fords, and they crossed and recrossed the river continually. Pale cascades hung down the sheer mountain wall above them, blowing off of the high slick rock in wild vapors. In 8 days they passed no other riders. On the 9th they saw an old man trying to get off the trail below them, caning a pair of burros through the woods. As they came abreast of this spot, they halted, and Glanton turned into the woods where the wet leaves were shuffled up, and he tracked down the old man sitting in the shrubbery, solitary as a gnome. The burros looked up and twitched their ears, and then lowered their heads to browse again. The old man watched him. "¿Por qué se esconde?" said Glanton. The old man didn't answer. "¿De dónde viene?" The old man seemed unwilling to reckon even with the idea of dialogue. He squatted in the leaves with his arms folded. Glanton leaned and spat. He gestured with his chin at the burros. "¿Qué tiene allá?" The old man shrugged. "Hierbas," he said. Glanton looked at the animals, and he looked at the old man. He turned his horse back toward the trail to rejoin the party. "¿Por qué me busca?" called the old man after him. They moved on. There were eagles and other birds in the valley, and many deer, and there were wild orchids and brakes of bamboo. The river here was sizable, and it swept past enormous boulders, and waterfalls fell everywhere out of the high, tangled jungle. The judge had taken to riding ahead with one of the Delawares, and he carried his rifle loaded with the small, hard seeds of the nopal fruit, and in the evening he would dress expertly the colorful birds he'd shot, rubbing the skins with gunpowder and stuffing them with balls of dried grass and packing them away in his wallets. He pressed the leaves of trees and plants into his book, and he stalked tiptoe the mountain butterflies with his shirt out held in both hands, speaking to them in a low whisper, no curious study himself. Toadvine sat watching him as he made his notations in the ledger, holding the book toward the fire for the light, and he asked him what was his purpose in all this. The judge's quill ceased its scratching. He looked at Toadvine. Then he continued to write again. Toadvine spat into the fire. The judge wrote on, and then he folded the ledger shut and laid it to one side and pressed his hands together and passed them down over his nose and mouth and placed them palm down on his knees. "Whatever exists," he said, "whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent." He looked about at the dark forest in which they were bivouacked. He nodded toward the specimens he had collected. "These anonymous creatures," he said, "may seem little or nothing in the world. Yet the smallest crumb can devour us, any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of men's knowing. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth." What's a suzerain? A keeper or overlord. Why not say keeper, then? Because he is a special kind of keeper. A suzerain rules even where there are other rulers. His authority countermands local judgments. Toadvine spat. The judge placed his hands on the ground. He looked at his inquisitor. "This is my claim," he said, "and yet everywhere upon it are pockets of autonomous life. Autonomous. In order for it to be mine, nothing must be permitted to occur upon it save by my dispensation." Toadvine sat with his boots crossed before the fire. "No man can acquaint himself with everything on this earth," he said. The judge tilted his great head. "The man who believes that the secrets of the world are forever hidden lives in mystery and fear. Superstition will drag him down. The rain will erode the deeds of his life. But that man who sets himself the task of singling out the thread of order from the tapestry will by the decision alone have taken charge of the world, and it is only by taking such charge that he will effect a way to dictate the terms of his own fate. I don't see what that has to do with catching birds. The freedom of birds is an insult to me. I'd have them all in zoos." "That would be a hell of a zoo." The judge smiled. "Yes," he said, "even so." In the night a caravan passed, the heads of the horses and mules muffled in stirrups, led along silently in the dark, the riders cautioning one to the other with their fingers to their lips. The judge atop a great boulder overlooking the trail watched them go. In the morning they rode on. They forded the muddy Yaqui River, and they rode the stands of sunflowers tall as a man on horseback, the dead faces dished toward the west. The country began to open up, and they began to come upon plantings of corn on the hillsides, and a few clearings in the wilderness where there were grass huts and orange and tamarind trees. Of humans they saw none. On the 2nd of December of 1849, they rode into the town of Ures, capital of the state of Sonora. They had not trotted half the length of the town before they had drawn about them a following of rabble unmatched for variety and sordidness by any they had yet encountered. Beggars and proctors of beggars, and whores, and pimps, and vendors, and filthy children, and whole deputations of the blind and the maimed and the importunate, all crying out, "Por Dios," and some who rode astride the backs of porters and hied them after, and great numbers of folk of every age and condition who were merely curious. Females of domestic reputation lounged upon the balconies they passed with faces gotten up in indigo and almagra, gaudy as the rumps of apes, and they peered from behind their fans like a kind of lurid coyness, like transvestites in a madhouse. The judge and Glanton rode at the head of the little column and conferred between themselves. The horses cantered nervously, and if the riders rowelled an occasional hand clutching at the trappings of their mounts, those hands withdrew in silence. They put up that night at a hostel at the edge of the town run by a German who had turned over the premises to them entirely, and was seen no more for either service or payment. Glanton wandered through the tall and dusty rooms with their withy ceilings, and at length he found an old criada cowering in what must have passed for a kitchen, although it contained nothing culinary save a brazier and a few clay pots. He set her to work heating water for baths, and pressed a handful of silver coins on her, and charged her with setting them some kind of board. She stared at the coins without moving, until he shooed her away, and she went off down the hallway, holding the coins cupped in her hands like a bird. She disappeared up the stairwell, calling out, and soon there were a number of women busy about the place. When Glanton turned to go back down the hall, there were 4 or 5 horses standing in it. He slapped them away with his hat and went to the door and looked out at the silent mob of spectators. "Mozos de cuadra," he called. "Venga, pronto." 2 boys pushed through and approached the door, and a number of others followed. Glanton motioned the tallest of them forward, and placed one hand on top of his head, and turned him around and looked at the others. "Este hombre es el jefe," he said. The jefe stood solemnly, his eyes cutting about. Glanton turned his head around and looked at him. "Te encargo todo, ¿entiendes? Caballos, sillas, todo." "Sí, entiendo." "Bueno, ándale, hay caballos en la casa." The jefe turned and shouted out the names of his friends, and half a dozen came forward, and they entered the house. When Glanton went down the hall, they were leading those animals, known man-killers some, toward the door, scolding them, the least of the boys hardly taller than the legs of the animal he'd taken in charge. Glanton went out to the back of the building and looked about for the ex-priest, whom it pleased him to send for horse and drink, but he could not be found. In trying to arrive at a detail which might reasonably be expected to return at all, he settled on Dr. Irving and Shelby, and gave them a fistful of coins, and returned to the kitchen again. By dark there were half a dozen young goats roasting on spits in the yard behind the hostel, their blackened figures shining in the smoky light. The judge strolled the grounds in his linen suit, and directed the chefs with a wave of his cigar, and he in turn was followed by a string band of 6 musicians, all of them old, all serious, who stayed with him at every turn, some 3 paces to the rear, and playing the while. A skin of pulque hung from the tripod in the center of the yard, and Irving had returned with between 20 and 30 whores of every age and size, and they were deployed before the door of the building, whole trains of wagons and carts overseen by impromptu sutlers, crying out each its bill of particulars, and surrounded by a shifting gallery of townspeople, and dozens of half-broken horses for trade, that reared and whinnied in desolate-looking cattle and sheep and pigs, together with their owners, until the town that Glanton and the judge had hoped to lay clear of was almost entirely at their door, and a carnival underwritten with that mood of festivity and growing ugliness common to gatherings in that quarter of the world. The bonfire in the courtyard had been stoked to such heights that from the street the entire rear of the premises appeared to be in flames, and new merchants with their goods and new spectators were arriving regularly, together with sullen groups of Yaqui Indians in loincloths who would be hired for their labor. By midnight there were fires in the street and dancing and drunkenness, and the house rang with the shrill cries of the whores, and rival packs of dogs had infiltrated the now partly darkened and smoking yard in the back, where a vicious dog fight broke out over the charred racks of goat bones, and where the first gunfire of the night erupted, and wounded dogs howled and dragged themselves about, until Glanton himself went out and killed them with his knife, a lurid scene in the flickering light, the wounded dogs silent save for the pop of their teeth, dragging themselves across the lot like seals or other things, and crouching under the walls while Glanton walked them down and clove their skulls with the huge copper-backed belt-knife. He was no more than back inside the house before new dogs were muttering at the spits. By the small hours of the morning most of the lamps within the hostel had smoked out, and the rooms were filled with drunken snoring. The sutlers and their carts were gone, and the blackened rings of the burned-out fires lay in the road like bomb craters, the smoldering billets dragged forth to sustain the one last fire about which sat old men and boys, smoking and exchanging tales. As the mountains to the east began to shape themselves out of the dawn, these figures too drifted away. In the yard at the rear of the premises, the surviving dogs had dragged the bones about everywhere, and the dead dogs lay in the dark shingles of their own blood dried in the dust, and cocks had begun to crow. When the judge and Glanton appeared at the front door in their suits, the judge in white and Glanton in black, the only person about was one of the small hostlers asleep on the steps. "Joven," said the judge. The boy leaped up. "Eres mozo de caballero?" "Sí, señor. A su servicio." "Nuestros caballos," he said. He would describe the animals, but the boy was already on the run. It was cold and a wind was blowing. The sun not up. The judge stood at the steps, and Glanton walked up and down, studying the ground. In 10 minutes the boy and another appeared, leading the 2 horses saddled and groomed in a nice trot up the street, the boys at a dead run, barefoot, the breath of the horses pluming, and their heads turning smartly from side to side.